It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the ineffable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How are you this morning, John?
I'm great. How you doing today, Andy?
Oh, I'm ready to ride, John. I mean, we have one of the great heroes of American history to discuss, and we have our relevant one of our resident experts on the Revolutionary period in American history, and that is Robert Begley, to join us on the
Welcome
show.
back to the show,
Welcome to the show,
Robert.
Robert.
Thank you, gentlemen. Happy to
I
be
keep
here
missing you.
talking about Washington.
I'm
Who
glad
you
I
calling
finally get to
gentlemen?
do this with you.
Who you calling gentlemen? But okay, I think we could survive that epithet. No, we're gentlemen. We certainly treat the ladies with respect, as a gentleman should. So now, a few weeks ago, we made a good start on the life of George Washington, first among the founders. But there's a lot to discuss. So today we want to finish with it. I have a whole bunch of questions for you, Robert, that I know you could answer. But before that, maybe you want to say something about the logo that we even use on the Hero Show.
Let me turn it around the other way. Yeah, so this is what the logo looks like, right? That you guys have.
Yes.
George Washington crossing the Delaware. That's classic.
Yeah, for those listening on the podcast, he's got a neat little statue of Washington crossing the Delaware. That's created from the Lutz Washington crossing the Delaware painting, right? Who sculpted that?
Exactly,
Yeah,
It's beautiful.
We should mention that magnificent painting. One of my all-time personal favorites, hanging at the Met in New York City, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Emanuel Leutze, Washington crossing the Delaware. It's famous. Everybody knows it. But when you go to the Met, you see a person, you're staggered by the size of it. I mean, Leutze really captured the epic scale of Washington the man and Washington's accomplishment here in that painting. Right? I mean, it's larger than life. Let's put it that way.
And it has to be to capture its figure. And we should mention, too, that our friend Joseph Kellard has written a really nice piece for the Objective Standard. I'll make sure to amend our links and add that to this. But he talks about the genesis of that painting and going to see it himself. And it's just a beautiful thing, beautiful piece of American history, or has become one.
Right. Yeah. You're right. And when we're talking about the larger than life character, we should mention Washington's physical stature. I don't know if we discussed. I mean, he was a big man, 6'3", 6'4", somewhere in that range. Powerful man. What was that story about? Throwing a silver dollar across the Rappahannock River in Virginia? It was just whether it's true or apocryphal, I don't know. But we know he was a powerful man with an upright military carriage, and he really cut a presence when he entered the room. Is that right, Robert?
That's absolutely right. So on top of his height was his style. He always dressed in a particular way where when he walked into the room, everybody looked at him, and mostly everybody looked up to him but not only did he tower physically, he wore his clothes well. He had like the latest styles, went to the Constitutional Convention. The Continental Convention in uniform, pretty much knowing that he would be elected to lead the army. So whenever Washington, even on the dance floor, he was a fabulous dancer. So larger than life appearance that made people look up to him.
Some people, and also I think some people just have a presence. They have that it factor, and you don't have to be 6'3", 6'4", and built like a linebacker. There's something in your soul, in your spirit, that causes you to stand a certain way, your eyes to look a certain way, your facial expressions. Washington had that it factor. He just had a presence. And like from what people said, when they were with Washington, they knew they were in the presence of a great man.
That's right.
I think that's Yeah. So, John, I know we have a bunch of questions for Robert. About one question I think that we need to discuss today, of course, is what was Washington's role at the Constitutional Convention, and then, of course, as the first president, the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion, and what was the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion, and the way Washington handled it. What was and then there was the political infighting, the formation of the political parties, and the endless important dispute between Jefferson and Hamilton. I know you're an expert on, Robert, and what was the significance of that dispute and Washington's attempt to adjudicate it for the future of American history. Washington's farewell address, why is that important? How did he attempt to deal with the American Indians? In settling the West. All of this, I think, had tremendous impact on the development of American history. And I think these are all important, burning questions that we need to discuss. What do you think, guys?
Absolutely. Where do you want to start? We'll jump right in.
Yeah, maybe we should start with Shay's rebellion, leading up to the Constitutional Convention, and what sort of impact that had on Washington's thinking.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. Maybe Robert, you want to explain to our viewers.
Daniel Shay was in the Continental Army. He fought for independence. He was from Massachusetts, and he didn't like being taxed. He thought the battle of the war was about tax. So he gathered, and the problem was, as a farmer up in New England, they pretty much were living on subsistence, just a little bit above subsistence. So because of this tax, he gathered a militia, he gathered locals, and had this rebellion, and they were ready to march to the Capitol and demand, retribution. Washington and Hamilton and Madison, all three of them, thought this would descend into anarchy. So something needed to be done to unite the states. So you can't have one state, Massachusetts, just asserting taking this action and threatening to go to the state capital, the country's capital, or the 13 colonies capital in Philadelphia, and demand retribution. So it took some time, but it was eventually squashed, and this was the impetus. So anarchy, if we look at the two systems, the two extreme systems that the founders were afraid of, one was monarchy and the other was anarchy. And in this case, they thought that Shay's rebellion represented anarchy. So an action for a strong federal central government to handle these kinds of disputes was needed. Right. And that's where the idea for the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton
I could see
Madison took.
I could see the justice on both sides, right? I mean, Shay and the soldiers were, from what I understand of American history, were right in their cause, that they fought and bled for independence. They hadn't been paid, like you said. They were at a subsistence level. They deserved remuneration. All of that's true. But like you said, you can't have, a civilized society where every time somebody has a just cause, they get their guys together and they commit acts of violence and vandalism. It's just, so it had to be squashed. That's not the way to go about seeking the remuneration that they so justly deserve. So I can understand Washington's, and Hamilton and Madison's thinking on this issue. Makes sense.
Yeah. The Articles of Confederation led to the problem by not being strong enough to figure out how to pay these soldiers. And when Washington resigned his post from the army, right, he said this is justice. We need to pay these people. This is a debt of honor. And, not only were the Articles of Confederation not strong enough to pay the soldiers, but then on top of that, they weren't strong enough to then deal with the rebellion that was about to crop up because of their failure to pay them, right? And
that reminds me of something, guys. I'm sorry, Jay.
Yeah, go for it.
But that reminds me of something, Robert. We didn't discuss the Newburgh Mutiny. Was on this issue, wasn't it? When Washington was able to put that down, yes, right near the end of the war. Wasn't the mutiny about also, at least in part, getting paid?
Same thing. Same exact thing. And that's when Washington took off his glasses and said, not only have I grown gray, but blind in service of my country. And they started weeping. Washington was a great actor, by the way. We should know that. He loved the theater and he took advantage of that. In the proper
it's part of his presence. Right? It's part of his presence.
Exactly. So the Newburgh, and then if we could even set the context a little bit more, Shay's Rebellion, there was dissent. There were unpaid debts. In fact, the debt was so high that not even the interest was being paid. There were border disputes. There were currency disputes. So the states were totally ununited at the time, because they were no longer colonies. They were states. They were 13 free and independent states that were not harmonious. And Shay's Rebellion was probably the last straw where those who wanted that stronger federal central government decided, no, we can't keep going this way. We need to have a gathering to decide the future of the country. And Madison and Hamilton, the way they pitched it was, we're going to amend. Because if they said we're just going to write a brand new constitution, nobody would have came. So they said, we're just going to amend the Articles of Confederation. And then with that, they convinced Washington to attend. He had retired, went back to his farm, was a businessman, loved life there. But the fear of anarchy is one of the things that brought him back into the public office, public service, I should say.
If I could just throw out a quote from Washington about Shay's Rebellion, I think it really highlights what you're saying here. This was in 1786, and he said, "The principle of self-government, which we had fought a war to secure, seemed to be threatened. For the rulers, Shays and his followers were rebelling against were their own representatives. It is but the other day that we were shedding our blood to obtain the constitutions under which we now live, constitutions of our own choice and making, and now we are unsheathing the sword to overturn them." So he said to, who was it on the ground? His artillery captain. You probably know this, Robert. But he said, "Know precisely what the insurgents aim at, and if they have real grievances, redress them if possible. If they have not, employ the force of government against them at once." Stop
Henry
the anarchy.
Knox. Yeah, I think it was Knox.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You got it. That's a great quote. I think we did a good job explaining Shay's Rebellion. They don't teach American history anymore, and so many people don't know it. Maybe we should just take a minute to explain the Newburgh Mutiny, because I think very few people know about it. And then, which is a great scene, like you said, Rob, it's a great moment in Washington's life. Very few people know about it. And then move ahead to the Constitutional Convention. You want to set the scene with the Newburgh Mutiny?
Well, similarly, the soldiers felt properly that they should be paid, and often they did this. Washington had convinced them over and over again, just a little bit more. We promise you'll be taken care of. And they reached a point in 1783, March or April, in Newburgh, New York. They gathered for a mutiny, and and similarly, so actually not even similar to Shay's, because it predated Shay's Rebellion. They were ready to march on the Capitol and demand, violently demand retribution for what they had undergone. And so this is how Washington's leadership skills came in. He knew they should be compensated. He was asking for money from Congress. Congress wasn't giving money because the states just wanted, here's where it was kind of like a flight of fancy. They just wanted this thing to go away, somehow win the war and not know anything about the debts. Robert Morris was paying out of his pocket for much of the Revolutionary War, but he couldn't do any more than he could have. The other states had to pitch in. And so you're right, Andy. This was one of the linchpins towards having these separate states. And again, military compensation, we know it today. It's because of those actions back then, and the actions that specifically Hamilton, giving them pensions, Hamilton and Washington took to thank them financially for their service in a sense, because they're not altruists. They didn't fight the war just for the sake of winning and then living a miserable life after the war. So in that sense, it's a good integration, Andy, between Newburgh and Shay.
And it's a great moment in Washington's life. Maybe you want to describe it. You said a little bit about it when he gets up to address his officers in Newburgh, and what he tells them, and he has them weeping and applauding and everything. It's like they would follow him to hell. So, do you remember?
So that was exactly what happened, and then he followed that again later on. We're now back in 1783 in New York. The British were still in New York until November of 1783, and that's actually one of the TOS pieces I wrote about Evacuation Day. And then his last few days at Fraunces Tavern, where several of those soldiers who were there in Newburgh were also at Fraunces Tavern. That was his real farewell as far as the troops go. That was his farewell to the troops speech. Right. And he didn't want to shake their hands. He couldn't get up. Again, Washington, the actor, he's like, I'm tired. You guys come to me, but I won't shake your hand. I'll give you a hug, each person. So the military, they felt vindicated that they backed the right man, the right leader, and that was Washington. And they certainly had put their mutiny away and were hoping for a brighter future, knowing that independence was the cause. That was what they fought for. Washington always calls it, the great cause, liberty and independence. But part of that is you don't fight for free. You're supposed to get paid. And that was where the weak Congress, weak Articles of Confederation did not live up to its expectations and therefore needed to be revamped.
I was thinking, and I know, John, you have questions, but I just want to finish off this point. You have a calendar, like great moments in the history of freedom or something. Mm-hmm. Rob Trosinski actually gave me this idea. But, a great moment at Newburgh when Washington, like you said, when Washington, is going to read his address to his officers who are ready to mutiny, and Washington puts on his glasses and said, what was it, Rob? He said, I've not only grown gray
in my service of my country, but I've grown blind. If I had glasses, I'd put them on.
And his officers start weeping, right? They get up, they start applauding or something like that. You just see Washington's stature, his presence. These guys are all ready to riot or mutiny anyway. And in a just cause, like you said, they deserve remuneration. And yet Washington's able to quiet them. The respect they have for Washington, we're going to get paid eventually. The commander said so, and they're with him. He gets them on his side. That's a great moment in American history, I think. From a great moment of a great man, great leader. Maybe he's got to be on anybody's short list of one of the greatest leaders in American history, right?
World history. Yeah. Nobody walked away. So I think we should move on to Constitutional Convention, but nobody walked away from the army, the leader of the army. One person, actually, Cincinnatus, had done it, which is why they called him that in the Roman Republic. But Cincinnatus didn't have a brand new country to deal with. Washington had a brand new country to deal with that he could easily have taken over and be handed the throne, but no, he walked away. That was the first time. Yeah. We'll get to the second time shortly.
So he resigns his post from the army, and then he's being asked left and right, and I think mostly by Madison, right, if he would attend this constitutional convention. What was he thinking, and then what had ended up happening with the convention?
Yeah, so it was Madison and Hamilton, and Hamilton was his right-hand man in the war, and that was where they saw how ineffective Congress was, because he's constantly begging for supplies and food and shoes for Valley Forge soldiers and getting turned down. So when it came time for peace, Hamilton knew how to play into Washington's, the role of fame and ambition in Washington's life. And basically Hamilton said, look, if this thing happens, if we win and we change this and have a constitution and you're not the leader, that'll be a blot on your record. So you have to be here and you have to preside. it was Benjamin Franklin who actually was the one that named Washington as the president of the Constitutional Convention. So that's, that, and for all of those reasons that we had already mentioned earlier, that anarchy and Shay's rebellion. One good quote, though, that a letter to Madison, Washington says, "Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth." And this is the farmer in Washington, and most of the founders were agrarian, and they got that. And what a statement! So of course, it's up to Washington to back that up, and
yeah, right. And they all realize too, right, that they don't want to just waste Washington's clout and his name on something that's a sort of halfway measure. There's a abortive attempt at a constitution, and they don't even want to have him there unless it's going to be this big earth moving event, right?
That's right. And at the convention, the other thing about Washington, he always had a poker face, and he did the least amount of talking. He did the most listening, but the least amount of talking. So as they're all giving their cases, Madison has the Virginia plan. There's a New Jersey plan. Hamilton speaks for 6 hours, and they're going on. But Washington is not. They know he wants it to pass, but he's not, in that sense, going to strong arm. He really wants the states to vote to ratify it.
Several years ago, elected president of the convention.
Yes, unanimous.
Right.
He's used to being unanimous. There's, if you talk about the stature of a leader, when you're unanimously voted for A, B, C, D, E, F, G, there's something, you have something going for you.
Right. Several years ago, I had a discussion with Brad Thompson, who we had on the show several weeks ago to discuss his brilliant new book. And of course, Dr. Thompson's an expert on America's revolutionary period. And as an aside, by the way, he promised to come back on the show and prove that John Adams was the most important of the founders. But anyway, I was having this discussion with him a few years ago. I'm a dilettante in American history, but to me, it seems George Washington would be the most important of the founders. And I asked him, could the War of Independence have been won without Washington's leadership? And he said no. And I said, well, could the Constitutional Convention ever have got off the ground without Washington agreeing to preside over it? And Brad Thompson said no. So it has these kinds of and of course, could the Constitution have been ratified without the tacit understanding that Washington would serve as the first president? And Brad Thompson said no. So it seemed to me it makes a case that George Washington was the most important of the founders. And as Dr. Thompson, agreed that certainly the founders looked at it that way. But so Washington's presiding over the Constitutional Convention was no small thing. I mean, it may very well be. I assume Brad Thompson's right. It may very well be the case that the Constitutional Convention would never have gotten off the ground without his agreement to preside on them. What do you think about that, Robert?
I totally agree with him on that. And author Richard Brookhiser, I'll actually read a quote later on from Brad from his excellent book. But Richard Brookhiser says George Washington was a CEO of two startups, Continental Army and the American Republic. And he presided over the most important board meeting in history, the Constitutional Convention. So he was indispensable. Without Washington, in many senses, there's no America. And there's a legitimate reason why he's called, since 1776, called the father of our country. So yeah, that's my take on that.
Some people say that Lincoln saved the United States and Washington made it. And I think that that's true, and that he did so really by uniting the states. I mean, he was this hardy adventurer who had traveled, and he really knew the land better than anyone, right? Except maybe Franklin. And he understood that the states needed to be welded together by a government really served their mutual interests. And so, even before the Constitutional Convention, people like Jefferson, when they referred to their country, they meant Virginia. And Jefferson and Madison on the Democratic Republican side, I know we'll get to this, and the Federalists on the other, really inaugurated party politics. But Washington avoided all of that partisanship, right? He was the guy that rose above and united people, and that's, I think, what his role was at the Constitutional Convention. He wasn't there to spearhead the plan, but without his stamp of approval, it would have never happened.
Yeah, exactly. So as a leader, one of the things, thank you for bringing that up, John, because I'm even remembering in the House of Burgesses, 20 years earlier, Washington knew how to get people to work together who had different talents. And we'll see this play out once he's elected president and his cabinet. He has a dream team cabinet. But at least initially, he knew how to go with different people's talents. Like Henry Knox was a bookseller in Boston. Now all of a sudden he's leading the Continental Army in different pockets of the war. So a great trait of a leader is knowing how to get people to work together to do their best. So we already saw from the mutinies that were squashed from the soldiers. But now if we talk about more of the statesmen and the more intellectual founders, Washington also knew how to optimize their talents. And once again, this played out. And he was well-traveled. He was well-traveled not only in fighting the war, but even as a child in the frontier. He saw the Ohio frontier as the future of the country going west. And I know Andy wants to talk about his relationship on the natives, which we could talk about later, but that he had a lot of interaction with them. So he was well-traveled. And after he became president, he made it a point to travel to all 13 colonies. So even though he had seen many of them during the war, coming in as president had served a different purpose there.
And it segues us nicely into the first presidency and all the precedents that Washington established. Because from my limited knowledge of this period in American history, the anti-ratifiers like Patrick Henry, and Joseph Ellis does a nice job discussing this in the quartet, right? They had a case. They feared a powerful federal government, just like like they feared the powerful British monarchy and Parliament. And part of what assuaged their fears, of course, was Madison's agreement to include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, but also I think the tacit understanding that Washington would serve as the first president. He would not be a dictator. He would not be a king. And I think that helped mollify the fears of some of the anti-ratifiers, and he would establish precedents for what the chief executive can and cannot do, and it would be respectful of freedom. Is that right, Robert? That the respect for Washington helped pave the way for the ratification?
Yep, that's totally right, Andy. And one thing that Ellis says I really like was the Federalists took the high ground by calling their opponents anti-Federalists. But really, they were all Federalists to some degree. But by calling them anti, it sounded like they were against the government. And he says many of them preferred ratifiers versus anti-ratifiers, shortened to rats versus anti-rats. And that would have given them the high hand. But those people often think the first two political parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, but it was really the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists that predated even the existence of the country as a united nation. So the Anti-Federalists eventually became the Democratic Republicans.
And now we're into the Washington presidency. He had some real problems to solve, didn't he? The financial problems, and of course he had Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury, and then the real ideological dispute between Hamilton and Jefferson and their respective supporters as to what kind of a country, what kind of a government is this going to be, what kind of a country. So Washington had some real problems to deal with in his presidency, didn't he?
Yeah. And the first thing, as we mentioned earlier, was the debt. How do you handle the debt? Many of them just wanted to forgive it, kind of like today's college students or leftist Democrats.
Right.
But both Hamilton and Washington knew that credit was what would build a nation. And by paying your debts, you earn that reputation that you are reliable. Sanctity of contract. Okay, so that's what they upheld in the sense that we have to pay the debt. How do we do this? First, Washington turned to Robert Morris, who had funded 90% of the war effort. Morris said, no, you're right, man. Hamilton knows how to do that. And the first thing was to assume the debts, okay, to have all the different states say, we're going to collect them and put them into one bucket, so to speak. And then secondly, to establish a national bank, which was privately run, but it would be for the purpose of not only settling that debt, but the future prosperity of the country. And then on top of that, do we want to remain only an agrarian economy, or do we see business, banking, commerce, and manufacturing as the way to the future? And that's where Hamilton and Jefferson were completely opposites. So, and this played out between North and South. If you look geographically, it was a North that was more pro banking, pro commerce, pro manufacturing, and the South was more agrarian. And even though many of the agrarians, in theory, wrote about slavery, but it largely depended on slavery. So that was the fundamental difference from the get-go between those two parts of the dream team, Hamilton and Jefferson.
And despite Washington's great leadership skills and his abilities to get people to work together, he couldn't resolve this dispute. Right? It was too philosophical. It was intractable. And I just want to say one thing about Jefferson, who we haven't discussed yet on the Hero Show, and at some point we will. In fairness to Jefferson, he was a staunch individualist. This is what I have great respect for Jefferson for. And he saw, every man, basically a landowner, had his own land, wasn't working for the man, was working for himself, doing what he loved, working the land. Government would be real small. You'd go into town, and what they say, all politics is local. Government would be very, very small and localized and not very strong, and individuals have an enormous amount of liberty. So, Jefferson was a staunch individualist. I could defend him on that. But Hamilton's vision, and I think Washington recognized that, didn't he? Hamilton's vision was the future for the United States, an industrialized, capitalist, urban society, and the greatest country in the world. I know that was Hamilton's vision, and he was right. Jefferson was mistaken on this, but Washington was with Hamilton on this issue, wasn't he?
Yeah, to be precise, that was Hamilton and Washington's vision, because Washington was a very successful businessman. He saw that as a future. He loved commerce. He loved inventions, transportation. He wanted to build canals. He had inventors always coming to his place. So a simple agrarian country was not enough. It was this bold, long-range vision that the two of them were completely in sync. The difference was Hamilton could write a 50-page essay that would fill all the gaps. And this is often what would happen. Jefferson would write something, send it to Washington. He would make a decision. He'd tell Hamilton about it. And then Hamilton would write something like prolific in defense of that. His report on manufacturers is a good example of that. So, and then Washington, as a great leader, would see both sides, and he usually sided with Hamilton. Not always. They definitely disagreed. But Jefferson and Madison were getting more frustrated because they thought, well, he's a Virginian. Washington's a Virginian. Why is he listening to this, this New York guy? But that's kind of one of the differences between theory and practice. Washington and Hamilton had been bloodied. They'd fought the war. The trust that they had for each other was in a way that cannot be replicated by two people just writing to each other across. Because at this time, before Jefferson came in to be Secretary of the State, he was in France for the entire Constitutional Convention. So him and Madison were writing to each other. And but Andy, if I can go to why the difference between the two caused Jefferson to resign as Secretary of State. But the main reason, which we haven't talked about yet, was the French Revolution. While heads were rolling in France, Jefferson was actually there and he defended it. And right. Washington had he had no patience for that. So while they're fighting during the French Revolution, once again, France and England are at war. And whereas France had backed America in the Revolutionary War, they assumed America would jump in and help them out, but not the case. So a pivotal moment in American history is when, at Hamilton's suggestion, Washington's proclamation of neutrality. And it basically said, look, we will deal with foreign nations. We will not get entangled in foreign affairs. We will only deal with them as trading partners, but we're not going to back either side militarily. And because Jefferson was such a Francophile and thought, no, America has to back France, that was the reason why he resigned in 1794, I think, 1793, 94.
And what was it that led to the split, the irrevocable split between Washington on the one hand and Jefferson and Madison on the other?
Yeah, so that happened later. So during Washington's second term, he wanted to step down after the first term, but there was too much tumult. The country was not ready yet to have him replaced. So in his second term, there was the Whiskey Rebellion, which had a French angle to it. Just to give you what the Whiskey Rebellion was about in a short
go
description.
ahead.
Western Pennsylvania, there were whiskey distillers, and they were not paying tax. We know how much the founding era despised tax, but guess what? To pay the debt, you can't just automatically write a blank check and that's going to bounce for the war effort to be settled. So one of the stipulations was there's going to be a tax on whiskey, and in Western Pennsylvania, there was another rebellion. They decided not to, and both Washington and Hamilton got on horseback and brought military troops. So here was once again the chance for anarchy, and they needed to show that no strong federal government would uphold the law of the land. And so that was another feature of Washington's second term, and the distinction between the two. But as his second term was going on, he was attacked as a monocrat, as senile, as a simpleton, not by Jefferson directly, but by his henchmen. Jefferson did not like face-to-face combat. Hamilton had no problem telling you in your face what he thought of you, but Jefferson will go through these writers, Freneau, some of these French citizens, Genet, and say tell his descriptions of the other founders. And once Washington saw that, he was like, I'm done. I'm done with you. In fact, his letters would be, "Dear Sir," would be just the standard. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm missing. But there was a hierarchy to how much he cared about you, and he reduced it both for Madison and for Jefferson towards the last 5 years of his life. He didn't correspond with either one of them, whereas he was, till the day he died, he was still very close to Hamilton. So that was sadly one of the differences, between the founders. They had these irreconcilable differences.
Yeah, I want to say a couple of things on this. I know John has some questions, but John, give me a minute. A couple of things. With the Whiskey Rebellion, you could see, the the settlers in Pennsylvania, the farmers, they had justice to their cause. I mean, we don't want to be taxed, by this government any more than we do by the British Crown. But this, Washington's in the right here. Rebellion is not the way a civilized society can conduct itself. We have courts for redress of grievances. You go through the court system. You work through the political system. You try to seek redress in the civil courts, or you try to elect legislators who will act on behalf of your grievances. Rioting and and rebellions is not the way you can have a civil society. And so Washington, I think, acted justly in putting it, sending military force, putting it down, and showing the power of the federal government to prevent anarchy, like you said before. And regarding Jefferson, as much as I respect him and admire him, I wrote on this in the hero book, that I use him as the main example of a flawed hero. One is in regards to slavery, but two in regards to his dishonesty in the way he conducted political affairs with his Federalist foes, both Washington and Adams. And Joseph Ellis, who's a terrific writer, said nicely, what was it about what you were saying, the dishonesty and hiding it and everything, and not having straightforward confrontations. Ellis said that Jefferson conducted, quote, an artful minuet with duplicity, unquote. How's that for beautiful writing? An artful minuet with duplicity. So I hate to say that about Jefferson, who did so many good things in his life, but we have to be honest. I will do that, John, when we discuss Jefferson on the on the show. But I'm sorry, I talk too much. I know you have questions for our guest.
No, well, John, also, we have to give him credit because his TOS piece on Jefferson also takes that angle. John, you want to talk about that?
Well, I'd like to maybe for just a second here. One thing that I think I might take issue with in the interpretation is just this idea that Jefferson was agrarian only. I think really the conflict between him and Hamilton, and indirectly with Washington, was what the Constitution allowed the government to do. And we could talk more about this when we discuss Jefferson. But Jefferson's perspective on it was, well, the Constitution does not give us the ability to do most of the things that Hamilton wanted to do, but specifically the bank. And Washington ultimately saw further. He saw that this was absolutely necessary, and that was the question. What did this came down to? What's necessary to run this government? Washington, I think, decided ultimately this is necessary to make this government work, and I think he was probably right on that. I think he saw further than a lot of people give him credit for. We think of him, to the extent that we think of him at all as a person, we think of him as the sort of action hero, the guy that went out and won the wars. But he also, he subscribed to 10 different newspapers. He was in constant contact with some of the most intelligent people in the world at the time. What do you think about Washington's just understanding of the philosophic importance of America? Was he, what were his thoughts on what he was doing and what America was going to be for posterity?
Great question. And that actually ties right into his farewell address. So if I could just quickly say, after his second term, constantly getting hammered by the press and called all these insults, while he is called senile and a simpleton, as you said, he's reading 10 papers a day, and he has 900 books in his library. So he was well read, well thought. And so the ideas, he was behind them. Whenever a founder wrote a book, he bought it. He had Jefferson's book, he had Adams's book, James Monroe he had. So he was a thinker. But as Ayn Rand says, thinkers who were men of action. He just wasn't a profound intellectual. And one of the authors is great. He says he didn't go to Harvard or to the Virginia William and Mary.
Yep.
And Mary. He went to war. Okay, so his education took place on the battlefield, which was practical, and in that sense, he he learned by example and failed quite a bit. But in his farewell, so after 2 terms, there's a couple of things. One is another precedent. He's elected twice, but he's not going to be, not only is he not going to run for a 3rd term, but he's going to step down while he's alive to leave that precedent that this is not a job for life. We're not monarchs here. We're going to step down and have a peaceful transition. And how did he announce this? Over a course of 6 months, he corresponded with Hamilton, who pretty much wrote the bulk of it. But his farewell address, he talks about what he calls the American character. And it's this dignified feeling of that independent streak, self-sufficient, looking for prosperity, an ambitious angle. So we could say all of those things similarly Jefferson had and Hamilton had. So that's part of his American character. But fiscal responsibility was another. There were like 4 pillars of his farewell address. Fiscal responsibility, paying your debts as a person and as a country. And in Washington's personal life, he was often land rich and cash poor, starting from the British taxing him too much when he was young. But even throughout his life, he wasn't always making enough at Mount Vernon, but he had a lot of property. So being fiscally responsible was another angle, and that he wrote in his farewell address. And then no foreign entanglements, which was for 100 years at least America's foreign policy, not getting involved, only dealing with foreign countries as traders, trading partners, but not backing one or the other, going to war for one or the other. And then education was a big part. He always felt bad that he wasn't well educated in the sense of going to a college. So he wanted that. He wanted kind of like an American university to be something where that American character, that independent, self-sufficient, kind of rugged individualist would be free to prosper as much as possible, but upholding rights. We haven't talked yet really about the individual rights. He was a total proponent from his House of Burgesses era, through fighting in the war, through his 2 terms as presidency. So the individual rights were a major factor in Washington's life. And this was the way he thought to uphold individual rights, which, as I said earlier, was mostly aligned with Hamilton. And later in life, after Washington had died, somebody had a pamphlet. It was so famous, by the way, the farewell address, 6,000 words. It was so famous for decades, for more than 100 years. But somebody was selling it. Hamilton's walking with his wife on the street, and they're selling Washington's farewell address. And Hamilton walks away. He says, "That man does not know that I'm the one that wrote that." So even though he wrote the bulk of it, Washington knew how to put into his own words perhaps somebody else's ideas. But again, the two were so aligned in so many ways.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Go ahead.
There's something I wanted to add here. A couple of points is Robert and John. Although Washington never went to Princeton or anything like that, he went to war instead. Somewhere along the line, he learned how to write. Because you read Washington's letters and you realize he's a terrific writer. I mean, his vocabulary, his sentence structure, he's very, very good. And it says something about 18th century education, being much better than in our day. Most of the leading 18th century figures were very good writers, but it says even more about Washington, who goes to war, but instead of going to college, nevertheless, develops into a very, very proficient writer. And the second point I was thinking of was Gary Wills, I think, American historian, who called Washington a virtuoso of resignation. Right? I mean, first he resigns from the army, then he resigns from the presidency, and this to me is the greatest thing of maybe the greatest man in American history. He was not a power luster. Washington did not seek power. And you're right. Freedom, liberty, individual rights was, what do we give to have Washington as president today? Although the culture, obviously militates against those principles mightily. But there's a quote. I think this is from Washington, Robert. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's where he said, "Government like fire is a dangerous servant." I mean, I think that's Washington, isn't it? I mean, what a
Yeah,
great
that is.
quote that is.
That is. Yep. Yeah. And the Enlightenment. He knew he was a product of the Enlightenment, and he knew that America could only be founded not during this age of ignorance and superstition, but where reason was upheld. And that's a big part of Washington's genius, I'll call it, because he knew he was a man, the right time, and put that into words. And if I could just piggyback on his writing, when he was young, he copied out 101 rules of etiquette in beautiful handwriting. That's another thing distinct about him. But he had a lot of misspellings when he was younger, and he had a nasty temper. And we all love Ben Franklin. You guys had a fabulous show about him. But Washington was just as much about self-improvement as Franklin was. That was a big part of who he was. And part of self-improvement is learning from your prior mistakes. And so his letters, you're right. I mean, they are works of art as far as, literature goes. I totally agree there.
What an extraordinary man! It really is extraordinary. John, I'm sure you have some more questions, but if not, what I still want to raise is as president, his dealings with the Indian tribes, because he dealt with them a lot of prejudice against the American Indians, Native Americans. Neither of those terms is accurate. But I think American Indians is less inaccurate, because Native Americans implies that they're indigenous to the North American continent, which is just false. They're tribes from Central Asia, so they're not from India, but at least that's the right continent, right? But yeah, I don't think Washington had the prejudice of the day against the American Indians as many people did. He dealt with them as foreign nations, didn't he? In his dealings with them as president, bring them to Philadelphia or New York to powwow with them, to parlay and things like that. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, Andy. But that happened from 30 to 40 years of experience with them. Since he was a child and surveying the frontier, he would run into them, and they liked gifts. So he would bring gifts, and unfortunately they liked alcohol, and he was a whiskey. By the time he died, he was a top whiskey distiller in the country. But
buy water, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. But yeah, so Washington knew, just like all other races, they were good and they were bad. And he tried to deal with the best of them on the best terms. And somebody said if Washington was an Indian, using that term from back then, he would be the top chief, riding his horse. They were great horsemen, and that's what Washington was as well. But he gave them respect to a high degree. He didn't equate them. They were not the equivalent of the European settlers, in his opinion. And but he wanted some amount of justice. He did not want them to be slaughtered. He wanted treaties with them, and he wanted them. But he knew also that the country would be going farther west into what they considered their territory. So yeah,
he wanted to see the Western tribes, if I remember correctly, give up their hunter-gatherer life and become agricultural, like the American settlers, which would have been in their self-interest, right?
That's right. A very good point, because he saw that again as what we know as civilization. They were not as civilized. That's just a fact. I mean,
it's just a historic fact. Yeah, it's just a historic fact. Right?
Braddock, when General Braddock was killed, the Battle of Monongahela, the pivotal moment in Washington's, he's 19, 20 years old, he made sure to bury and have horses and carriages go over the dirt where Braddock was buried, so he wouldn't be scalped. All right. So when you're scalping your enemy, this is not it's not a modern way of treating people. And so there were some vicious things, even going back. I wanted to jump in about that the Whiskey Rebellion, they tarred and feathered the tax collectors, okay? And that is just a nasty practice. So there was a lot of vicious evil that he was witness to that affected his decisions. And as far as the natives go, yeah, he wanted them to bring them up to, and same as the black slaves. He wanted to have them elevate instead of descending to their status.
Right.
Well, you mentioned slaves. Well, perhaps we should talk. We should talk for just a brief minute about his reputation and his dealings with slaves.
Yeah. So, if you're 11 years old when you inherit your first slave, that's going to probably affect what you think of them. That it's just part of life. But especially the last 2 decades of his life, when he knew Hamilton and Lafayette, who were incredible abolitionists, he changed his mind. He totally changed his mind. At one point, he said, "There's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." This is 1786, letter to Robert Morris. So, but he didn't think it could happen only by legislative authority. And if we go to his last summer of his life, 1799, he's already retired from the presidency. He updates his will. And in that will, which he writes in his beautiful handwriting, it's like 20-something pages long. 3 of those pages, he makes it very clear his slaves are to be freed. Okay? Martha Custis' slaves, he has no control over that. I don't even know if he told her he was going to do that, but he wanted his slaves to be free. He wanted that legacy as somebody who freed his slaves. His Billy Lee was his top slave assistant, and he saw that they were not inferior the way other Virginians thought. If, given the right opportunity, he just didn't think it was ready. He knew at the Constitutional Convention, if slavery was on the table, it wasn't going to happen. It was too steeped in the culture. And this is where we need to understand the context of the era, where it's so steeped that first you free the entire 13 colonies, and then you can work on freeing the other aspects. And so Washington, on his deathbed, has Martha come out, and he says, "Bring me my 2 wills." And he has her tear up the older one, so that the new one that says he will free his slaves was the one that went forward. And the only founder to do that. If you look, and also, again, this is another legacy. Sorry?
Right. Didn't Washington use some of the proceeds from his Mount Vernon estate to bequest to the slaves, so they had some money to adjust from a life of slavery to a life of freedom, which would be a tough adjustment for me, you, or anybody?
Yeah, there's great point, Andy. There's a couple of things there. So first of all, when he changed from tobacco, which was very slave intensive, but it destroyed the crops, and he wasn't making profits. The British were taking too much profits. So he changed to wheat and barley and corn and other simpler, more profitable grains and products. His slave force now had idle time. What did he do? He taught them to be blacksmiths, and they actually learned trades that they were actually very good at. But he also put aside money for those who were too young or too old to educate them, so that they could properly, at least have a head start in going into a free society. So yeah, they definitely needed some skills. That lasted until the 1830s, his fund for that purpose. So again, that's another legacy we must identify with Washington, that he freed a man who grew up steeped in slavery, lived enough over his 67 years to see that at least he could take an action. And of course, it would have been nice if he inspired the others who were younger than him to follow his example. We might not have had a civil war, but even during his lifetime, he said, if there's a war between the North and South, I'm backing the North because they have more of my values associated with that. And individual rights is the main thing. So he saw the hypocrisy. He was conflicted about slavery, and did more than any other slaveholder upon his death to eradicate it.
Well, John, Robert, I think we have done proper homage to a truly extraordinary man. Did you have something else you wanted to say, Robert?
Yeah, I got a couple of things here. So Brad
some
Thompson's excellent book. You see that? The Revolutionary Mind.
Yeah.
America's Revolutionary Mind. Yep.
Yeah. So this is page 336. No man lived and extended that spirit of liberty more than America's commander-in-chief, George Washington. More than any other revolutionary, he embodied the Aristotelian vision of the magnanimous man, a man whose greatness of soul stood above all others and was fixed by an animated love of liberty. His towering figure left most men, including many other truly great men, in awe. The example of his moral character did even more in his military tactics to inspire his troops. Well said there, Brad.
You know, Robert, when Brad comes on to prove, as he put it, that John Adams was the greatest of the founders, I'm going to read that quote.
I'm staying out of that. So can I just say one more thing about someone we all won't argue about?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Her tribute to George Washington takes place in one of the darkest scenes in Atlas Shrugged, when the bureaucrats are gathering to pass Directive 10287, 289. Yeah. So it starts off, Dr. Ferris says, we don't want to hear anything about the honest and the wise. And another villain, Jim Taggart, looks out the window at the obelisk of George Washington. So Ayn Rand is showing the distinction there, and he looks away. Taggart looks away. And then at the end of the chapter, when they end up passing the bill, Taggart walks over to the window and closes the blind. So in other words, he can't even look at or be seen by that towering figure who is wise and honest. And that's Ayn Rand's tribute to George Washington.
Beautiful. That is beautiful. John, did you have any last words you wanted to, words of wisdom to impart before we
I think
sign off?
At the end of when he resigned his post as military commander, he said, at this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own. And I think we have to look around today and just look at, what has become of this country and think about that quote. It's a pretty damning thing, but I think it's absolutely the case. Washington and many others put their lives on the line for us and built a nation based on the ideals of the Enlightenment. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be happy, if we don't, take it into our own hands to completely mess it up.
Amen to that, John. That is a great.
Yeah, amen is right. Taking personal responsibility is a enormous moral achievement and a necessity that we all need to teach our children, our students, live out ourselves to be a beacon to other people. Take responsibility. Washington's absolutely right. There's no reason in the United States today to be burning down American cities because a criminal got shot by police officers. I would certainly agree. I agree with the Black conservatives like Candace Owens. America is the land of opportunity for Black Americans, not the land of oppression. I think that's true for all Americans today, 60 years after the Civil Rights Movement. And I think Washington's right. When you live in a semi-free country, the responsibility for your life is yours, for no matter what race you are. So I think, wow, I mean, what a great show, gentlemen. Homage to maybe the greatest. John, we discussed Franklin as maybe the greatest American in history, but I think Washington has a legitimate claim on that also.
Yeah.
So I
think Franklin fully realized that at the Constitutional Convention when he was, he was originally going to be the one to nominate Washington, and he was sick and couldn't make it. I think maybe Morris did, but Franklin paid homage to Washington as well. I know Brad said he thinks John Adams was the greatest founder, but he even admitted that John Adams thought that Washington was the greatest among greats.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree, and I want to salute you.
I'll take the ball on my team, okay?
I want to salute all the founders, but today, especially President Washington. Thank you very much. Washington lived a heroic life, showed us what heroic life looked like, and I want to wish you and all of our viewers a more heroic life. So thank you for coming on the show, Robert. Great job.
Thank you, men. I won't call you gentlemen.
That's okay. Have a more heroic day, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
You too.
Thank you.